Chapter 13. Ahead, the red light glowed evilly, and the spectral figures moved into its aura to become cardboard silhouettes. Pooley and O'Malley lurched along to the rear of the strange brigade as silently as their inebriate blunderings would allow. None of the queer horde turned ahead, although the sounds of their pursuers, as they stumbled amongst corrugated plot dividers and galvanised watering cans, rang loudly across the silent allotments. As the stark figures neared the light, they fell into line and strode through the doorway of Soap Distance hut like so many clockwork soldiers. When the last of them had entered, the light grew to a blinding intensity, then dimmed away to nothingness. "There," said Pooley, faltering in his footsteps. "A trick of the light. Nothing more. Probably landing lights on a jumbo or some such. Off to our beds now then, eh?" O'Malley prodded him in the loins with the rake he had wisely appropriated in the interest of self-preservation. "Onward, Pooley," he ordered. "We'll get to the bottom of this." His words, as it happened, could not have been more poorly chosen, but O'Malley, of course, was not to know that at this time. The two men neared Soap's hut and peered through the open doorway. There was nothing to be seen but sheer, unutterable, unfathomable darkness. "Loiter," O'Malley commanded. Pooley brought out his aged Zippo and sucked at the wick. O'Malley snatched at the well-worn smoker's friend, and as the flame bravely illuminated the hut's interior, the two men gave forth with twin whistles of dismay. The shed was empty. 4 corrugated walls, a ceiling of slatted asbestos, and a concrete floor. John O'Malley groaned. Pooley shook his head in wonder. "These council lads certainly have the great Houdini with egg on his chin," he said respectfully. "How do you suppose they did it?" "I utterly refuse to believe this," said O'Malley, holding the lighter aloft and stepping boldly through the doorway. "There is no conceivable way. They could all have—" He never actually finished the sentence. Pooley's lighter was suddenly extinguished, and O'Malley's words were swallowed up as if sucked into some great and terrible vacuum. "John?" Pooley found himself alone in the darkness. "John, this is not funny." His voice echoed hollowly in the sinister hut. "Oh dear me," said Jim Pooley. The moon slowly withdrew itself from its cloudy lair and shone a broad beam of light through the open doorway. The tiny hut was empty. John O'Malley had simply ceased to exist. Jim snatched up O'Malley's discarded rake, prodding ahead of him as he gingerly moved forward. The moon was still shining brightly, and now, along the nearby rooftops, the thin red line of dawn was spreading. "Oh!" The tip of Pooley's protruding rake had of a sudden become strangely fuzzy and ill-defined. Another step forward, and Pooley noted to his utter stupefaction that it had vanished altogether into empty air. He withdrew it hastily and ran his finger along its length. It was intact. Jim looked at the rake and then at the empty shed before him. He scratched at his head, and then at his chin. He weighed the thing up and tried to make some sense of it. The shed was obviously not what it first appeared. An ingenious camouflage indeed, but to camouflage what? And most importantly, where was John? Obviously somewhere behind the simulated reality of the empty shed lurked another something, and obviously it was a thoroughly unwholesome something which boded ill for unwary golfers. Pooley approached the doorway once more and thrust the rake in up to the hilt. He waggled it about and swished it to and fro. It met with no apparent resistance. Jim pulled out the rake and stood a moment, re-scratching his head. It really was a very clever thing indeed. Possibly that was how these council lads had eluded them before. Probably the one in the Swan's Bog had switched on some sort of 3D projector, whipped up a holographic image of an empty cubicle, and sat down on the seat for a good sneer whilst O'Malley got foamy about the jaws. They were probably standing there in the shed even now, doing the same. Pooley took a step backwards. He'd show the buggers. Wielding the rake in as menacing a manner as he could, he took a deep, if-drunken breath and rushed at the image. "Mwah!" went Jim Pooley as the concrete floor of the shed dissolved beneath his feet, and he plunged down the perpetual darkness of the now legendary bottomless pit. How far Jim fell, and how long his plummet into the nether regions of the great beneath actually took, must remain for ever a matter for conjecture. That his life had plenty of time to flash before his eyes was of little consolation, although it did give an occasion for him to recall that during it he had consumed a very great deal of alcohol. Also, that should he survive this, he had every intention of consuming a great deal more. Finally, however, after what had been up till then a relatively uneventful, if windy, fall into oblivion, Pooley's descending form made a painful and quite unexpected contact with a body of ice-cold and seemingly unfathomable water. "Oh!" wailed that unhappiest of men. Pooley surfaced after several desperate and drowning moments, mouthed several very timely and well-expressed obscenities, and sank once more into the subterranean depths. "Oh, forgive all," he vowed, as his head bobbed aloft for a second time. Possibly Jim would have survived for a goodly while bobbing up and down in this fashion. It is more likely, however, that he would have breathed his last as he went down for that famous old third time, had help not arrived from a most unexpected quarter. "Climb aboard, Jim," said a voice which struck a strange chord in Pooley's rapidly numbing brain. Jim squinted up from his watery grave to realise for the first time that he was no longer in darkness. Above him he could see the cowled head and shoulders of a man, leaning from what appeared to be a coracle of skin and bark, extending a rugged-looking oar. Without hesitation, Pooley clutched at the thing and was unceremoniously hauled aboard. Huddled low in one end of the curious craft lay John O'Malley, swathed in blankets. "Nice of you to drop in," said the Irishman, with the rattling teeth. Pooley made some attempts to wring out his tweed lapels, but soon gave up and resigned himself to death by pneumonia. "Where are we?" he asked, peering about him. A wan light emanating from some luminescent substance within the very rocks, which swept dawn-like and dizzying high above them, illuminated a monstrous cavern. The black waters of the subterranean lake spread away in every direction, losing themselves into a great vastness of absolutely nothing. It all looked a little worrying. Jim shuddered, and not from the icy cold which now knotted his every muscle. It was the sheer mind-stunning hugeness of the place, and the fact that it actually existed somewhere deep beneath the roads where he daily set his feet. And those waters, what might lurk in them? It didn't bear thinking about. Jim turned to his saviour. "You have my thanks, sir," said he. "But tell me." His words trailed off as the dark figure turned from the oar he had been carefully slotting into its rowlock and confronted the dripping Brentonian. "Soap?" said Jim. "Soap, is that you?" The boatman slipped back the cowl which covered his head and grinned wolfishly. "Have I changed so much then, Pooley?" he asked. Jim surveyed the darkly clad figure, whose black robes threw the death-like pallor of his face into ghastly contrast. His hair was peroxide blonde, and his eyebrows and lashes naught but snowy bristles. Soap was as white as a proverbial sheet. Pooley recalled the ruddy-faced hollow earth theorist with the sparkling green eyes who had regaled them with talk of Ridge and Yeppo and the denizens of the world beneath. He also recalled only too well that terrible night when Soap had invited him and O'Malley into a fantastic tunnel system beneath his house to witness the opening of what Soap believed to be the portal to inner earth. Pooley and O'Malley had made a rapid exit from the workings, but Soap had gone through with the thing and opened what turned out to be the stopcocks of the old flood sluices of Brentford docks. An entire stretch of Grand Union Canal had drained forthwith into Soap's diggings, and that had been the last Brentford had seen of the hollow earther. Pooley stared at Soap in disbelief. "You do appear slightly altered in your appearance," he said carefully, as he gazed into the latter's eyes, now pink as an albino's and slightly luminous. 5 years below can alter any man," said Soap, readjusting his cowl. "I have seen things down here that would stagger the senses of the strongest man. I have seen sights which would drive the sanity from your head quicker than shite off a shovel." Pooley now also recalled that he and O'Malley had always been of the opinion that Soap was a dangerous lunatic. "Yes," said Jim, "indeed. Well then, again thanks for the old life-saving, and now if you'd kindly show us the way out of here, I feel that it must be nearing my breakfast time." O'Malley piped up with, "I've pork in the press if you care to come topside with us, Soap, my old mate." The hooded figure said no more, but sat carefully down and applied himself to the oars. The curious little craft, with its extraordinary crew, slowly edged its way across the pitch-black waters. How Soap could have any idea of which way he was travelling seemed totally beyond conjecture. Hours may have passed, or merely minutes. Time did not seem to apply here. Pooley's Piaget wristwatch had now ceased its ticking for good and all, and maintained a sullen, rusting silence. The high dome of rock seemed unchanging, and O'Malley wondered on occasions whether they were actually moving at all. Presently, however, a thin line of white appeared upon the horizon. "Land ho!" said Soap, grinning at his marrow-chilled passengers. "Would there be any chance of light at the end of the long dark tunnel?" Pooley asked, "such as nutrition, or possibly the warming quaff of ale or lick of spirits?" Soap tapped at his nose in a manner which the two remembered only too well. "You will be well cared for. You have been long expected." Upon that doubtful note, he withdrew once more into silence and rowed on towards land. The island, for such it now showed itself to be, was a strange enough place by any reckoning. As Soap beached the craft and ushered the two ashore, Pooley viewed the place with the gravest misgivings. There was a dreadful prehistoric gloom about it. If the black waters were bad enough, this was somehow worse. The island was a long, rough crescent, covered for the most part with enormous stalagmites. These gave it the appearance of the half-submerged jawbone of some long, dead behemoth. Pooley felt instinctively that to set foot on such a thing was direly wrong, and his thoughts were shared by O'Malley. Yet both were wet, cold, hungry, and demoralised, and with little complaint they numbly followed Soap along the bone-white beach to a craggy outcropping which seemed the highest point of the bleak landfill. "Would you kindly turn your backs for a moment?" Soap asked politely. Pooley eyed his colleague, and the blue-faced Irishman shrugged in his blanket shawl. Soap was but a moment in performing whatever action he had in mind, and when the two turned back, a great doorway yawned in the faceless rock, revealing a comfortable-looking room of extraordinary size. "Step inside quickly now, please. I have no wish to expose the entrance any longer than need be. There are eyes everywhere, even here." Pooley shook his head in redoubled wonder, and the two men scuttled inside, followed by their amiable, if enigmatic, host. The door swung shut, predictably leaving no trace whatsoever of its existence. "Now," said Soap, "cup of tea, is it?" A thin smile flickered momentarily upon O'Malley's Arctic boat race. "Only Soap Distant could offer a cup of tea at the Earth's call." "There have been others," said Soap, indicating the letters A.S., which were scratched into the stonework of one of the walls. "But that is another story entirely." Pooley cast his eyes about the room. It had all the makings of the average Brentford front-sitter. The moquette three-piece, the nylon carpet, the occasional table whose occasion was yet to come, the fitted bookshelves, and the television set. But for the hewn rock walls and the obvious lack of windows, one might have been fooled into believing that all was suburban mundaneness. "Surely reception hereabouts must be a little ropey," said Jim, indicating the television. "Kept purely through nostalgia for my former existence," said Soap. "Now, my suggestion of a nice hot cuppa is eliciting very little in the way of positive response. I have some fine Riesling in my cellar, or perhaps some Bordeaux red. Shall I open a case or two?" "That would be the thing," said Pooley with some enthusiasm. Events have sorely taxed us of late. Soap Distant vanished from the room, away down a flight of hewn rock steps which had escaped previous mention. Pooley and O'Malley sat a moment in silence before the great man of air gave voice. "If I might say so, Jim," John ventured, "your suggestion of having it away to our cosy beds and start afresh on the morrow was one which I really should have picked up on before it went out of fashion." "I blame nobody," said the noble Jim, "but would sincerely ask what in the name of all the holies we are doing in this godforsaken place, and how we might facilitate our escape." Soap appeared from the cellar, cradling several bottles of wine in his arms. "The day is yet saved," he said, beaming hideously. "The cellar brims with vintage vino of all varieties. I have brought up a selection." O'Malley, who was certain that the day was very far from being saved, rubbed his hands thoughtfully together. "Why are we here, Soap?" he asked. "Well, now, that is a question and no mistake," the other replied. "Some incline towards the theory of a divine creator with reasons of his own for doing things. Others favour the theory of natural selection, or hint that we are nothing more than an accident of DNA. I myself have a rather more radical theory." "No doubt," said John sourly, "but you know perfectly well that is not what I meant. Why are we here? That is Pooley and myself, here, that is, sitting upon this ghastly settee, slowly but surely freezing to death." Soap popped the corks from two of the bottles and handed them one apiece to his guests.
In words of one syllable, said Sorp, you are in big struck. I think you might do well to take a sup or two before I fill you in on the details.
The two Sub-Zero golfers did not need telling twice, and in a matter of seconds 2 bottles of vintage Rhine wine had vanished away into the nether regions of 2 stomachs. "The floor would seem to be yours," said Jim, wiping his chin. "Is there any more of this?" Sorp handed over 2 more bottles and positioned himself in a dignified pose against the stucco fireplace.
"As you will remember," he said, "I've spoken to you many times in the past about the family distance conviction that an entire world exists here, beneath the earth's surface, and that it is peopled by super-beings, benign and benevolent, who would bestow the great wealth of their knowledge upon the man from above who came in peace to speak with them."
John and Jim nodded thoughtfully.
"Well, I was wrong."
"Tough luck," said O'Malley. "C'est la vie, as the French say." "Are you certain?" Pooley asked. Sorp had always spoken with such conviction that even though Jim considered him to be 3 halfpenny short of a shilling, he had half romantically wondered whether his tales might be true.
"I am indeed certain," said Sorp. "It is the exact opposite. There are dwellers beneath, but far from being benign and benevolent, they are foul and evil, and intent upon one thing only, to leave this world of darkness and conquer the sun-soaked realm above."
Sorp's pink eyes travelled upwards, and John and Jim's followed them. No, said O'Malley. I cannot believe all of this. Surely, if it were so, these fellows would have emerged years ago. They could surely have dug their way out. How did they come to be here in the first place?
"Ah," said Soap, giving his nose an annoyingly significant tap. "That is a tale indeed, and if you have time, I will tell it."
"It would seem," said John, "that unless you feel so inclined as to lead us skywards, then we have all the time in the world."
"Certainly you are a captive audience, but I must press upon you that this is a very important business, and that your help is sorely needed. I have no wish to return to the service. My world is here, but neither do I have the wish to see mankind destroyed by these beings, or worse still, driven here to plague me."
John took off one of his boots and emptied the contents into a nearby aspidistra pot. "Go on then," he said. "Let's hear it." Soap withdrew a shining disc from an inner pocket and held it towards his guests.
"You recognise this, no doubt?"
Pooley peered at it and nodded. "The symbol is the same as size on the allotment. You wouldn't happen to know what it means, by any chance?"
"I would, and so would Professor Slocum."
"Well, he certainly didn't feel fit to confide in us. See, the 5th of the 10 was all we got for it."
"I was in the room when he told you," said Sorb. "The Professor and I have known about the symbols and the plans of the Syrians for some time. We agreed that we should enlist help to assist with their destruction. Men of enterprise, we agreed, men of sterling stuff, good men and true, hearts of oak, valorous men with big—"
Yes, said O'Malley. "Naturally you thought of us."
"Actually, no," said Soap. "We had hoped that small Dave might be passing, but as you turned up—"
"Thanks a lot," said O'Malley. "I nearly jammed," said Jim.
"Just my little joke," said Sorp, smiling sweetly. "The Professor said that you two were his first choice."
Pooley groaned pathetically. "It would seem, John," said he, "that we have been press-ganged." O'Malley nodded bleakly. "As running is obviously out of the question, I suggest we waste no more time. Tell your tale, Soap."
"Thank you, John. I expected at least a blow or two to the head. I'm glad you're taking it so well. What I'm about to tell you might seem a little hard to believe, but I can assure you it is all true."
"No doubt," said O'Malley.
"The symbol upon this disc,"
Soap held the glittering item aloft,
"means literally what the Professor told you. I am C, the 5th of the 10. It is the insignia of the planet Ceres, which was once the 10th planet in our solar system, 5th from the Sun. Ceres was the home world to a most advanced race of beings that commuted between the planets much in the way that you or I might take a 65 bus up to Ealing Broadway. Their world was small and their population large. They needed another planet similar to theirs for colonization. Naturally enough, their eyes turned towards Earth, a world at that time only sporting a primitive society which offered little opposition to such an advanced race. They sent out scout parties, who were pleased to discover that the simple Earthers hailed them as gods. No doubt the Syrians would be running the place even now had their warlike natures not got the best of them. A great war developed upon Ceres, and while a considerable number of the lads were here arranging matters to their satisfaction, their entire planet was totally destroyed, leaving them marooned. The cataclysm was, if you will pardon the expression, somewhat earth-shattering, and the shocks were felt here. A travelling asteroid, the moon as we now know it, was blown into orbit around the Earth, causing absolute devastation. Half of the world was flooded. Those Syrians who survived the Holocaust did so by withdrawing here and sealing themselves in. Little remained to ever prove their existence but for legend. The Syrian survivors never lost hope. Although they were few in number, and the centuries which passed saw mankind's development slowly approaching that of their own, still they remained, waiting and plotting, for they had one thing to wait and plot for. Shortly before the planet's destruction, the men of Ceres had sent a great strike force out of this solar system to seek other stars and other worlds. The Syrians knew they could one day return, and finding no Ceres, would put two and two together and revisit the Earth. Thus they have remained, waiting and waiting, preparing for this return. They are doing so still, and their time has almost come. Even as I speak, the Syrian strike force is streaking across the cosmos bound for Earth, and they've only one thing upon their minds. Sorp ceased his fantastic monologue, and Pooley and O'Malley stared at him, dumb and slack-jawed. "If you don't mind me saying so," said John at length, "and please do not construe this as any criticism of yourself or your character. That is the most absurd piece of nonsense I have ever had the misfortune of listening to." "I've seen the film," said Pooley, dubbed from the original Japanese it was. "And the lights upon the allotment," said Sorp. "What would you take those to be?"
"The work of the council," said O'Malley firmly. "Another plot to confound the honest golfers." Soap burst into a paroxysm of laughter. Tears rolled down his pale cheeks, and he clutched at his stomach. "Come now," said Pooley, "it is no laughing matter. Those lads have it in for us."
"Have it in for you?" gasped Sorp between convulsions. You witness a dozen of laser-operated gravitational landing beams, the product of a technology beyond earthly comprehension, and you put it down to the work of Brentford Council?"
"If you will pardon me," said Pooley, somewhat offended, "if it is the product of a technology beyond earthly comprehension, I hardly feel that we can be blamed for finding it so." "Quite," said O'Malley.
And your journey here through the solid concrete floor of an empty allotment shed."
"I have been meaning to ask somebody about that," said John. "It was a hologram," said Pooley, matter-of-factly. "Oh, of course, one of those lads."
I must apologise for your rapid descent," Sorp explained. "I had a great deal of trouble in keeping the door open long enough for you both to enter. I was unable, however, to stop the Syrians bringing down the lift."
"Come now," said Pooley, who had always been fond of the phrase. "Be fair, Soap. All this is a little hard to swallow."
"Nevertheless, it's true. As true as the fact that you are sitting here, a mile and a half beneath Penge, drinking 150-year-old Rhine wine."
Penge. Pooley shook his head once more. Where the hell is Penge?
"I've never been quite certain myself, but I'm told it is a very nice place."
John and Jim finished their second bottles and sat in silence, wondering what in the world they were to do next. O'Malley sat glowering into the carpet. Pooley took off his jacket, which was starting to steam at the shoulders. "All right," he said at last. "Say that we do believe you."
"I don't,"
O'Malley interrupted. "Yes, well, say that we did. What do you suppose we can do about it? How can we," he indicated himself and his bedraggled companion, "how can we battle it out with an intergalactic strike force? I myself possess a Barlow knife, which is good for whittling, and O'Malley has an air pistol. Could you perhaps chip in with a few SAM missiles and the odd thermonuclear device?"
"Sadly no," said Sorp, "but I am open to any suggestions at this time."
"I've one to make," said John O'Malley. Pooley covered his ears.